Summer, 1941. The sun sets over the spires of Leningrad, painting the Neva River gold. In the parks, families stroll with ice cream. Children laugh beneath birch trees. The sound of an accordion drifts over the water. The people do not yet know that this will be their last peaceful summer for almost 3 years. Far to the west, the ground shakes beneath the boots of an army. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, has begun. In 3 months, 3 million German soldiers have crossed the border. Towns vanish overnight. Cities fall like dominoes. And now the Führer's gaze turns north, to the cradle of the Russian Revolution, to the city that bears Lenin's name, Leningrad. He calls it the heart of Bolshevism. He does not intend to occupy it. He intends to erase it. By September, the German Army Group North, reinforced by Finnish troops from the north, has reached the outskirts. Railways are cut. Roads are mined. The last bridges fall. On September 8, 1941, Leningrad is encircled. Inside are 2.5 million people, men, women, children, workers, artists, soldiers, and nurses, trapped within their own city. Factories continue to hammer steel for tanks. The symphony hall still holds concerts. Babies are still born. But now, they live in the shadow of annihilation. The Germans shell the suburbs. Fires rage for days. Warehouses burn, including one that stores most of the city's grain and sugar. Within a week, the food reserves are nearly gone. The Soviet leadership swears the city will never surrender. Stalin himself gives the order, Leningrad must stand. So the people prepare, digging trenches through parks, turning libraries into hospitals, classrooms into barracks. Statues are buried for protection. Paintings from the Hermitage are carried into cellars. Every able-bodied citizen is conscripted into labor battalions. They do not know what is coming. They do not know that they will endure 872 days of siege, that they will freeze, starve, and suffer beyond imagination. But they believe, fiercely and completely, that their city, their home, will never fall. Autumn descends upon Leningrad like a sentence. By October, the ring around the city has closed completely. From the north, the Finns control the forests. From the south and west, German artillery dominates the plains. The last railway link to Moscow is cut. No trains will arrive again. The city becomes an island, surrounded not by sea, but by fire. Every day, the sky screams with the sound of Stuka dive bombers. Every night, the horizon glows red from burning suburbs. Air raid sirens wail without rest. The city's defenders, under General Zhukov, dig deeper trenches and build barricades from tramcars and stones. The citizens work beside soldiers, hammering through exhaustion. The first casualties are not soldiers, but civilians, hundreds killed as the Luftwaffe bombs factories, schools, hospitals. Smoke fills the air for weeks. The smell of burning rubber and flesh becomes part of daily life. And then comes the silence of starvation. Rations are cut again and again. 500 grams of bread a day for soldiers. 300 grams for workers. 125 grams, a small slice, for children and the elderly. The bread is no longer bread. It is made of sawdust, floor sweepings, and traces of flour. People boil wallpaper paste for glue. They eat leather belts, pets, weeds pulled from frozen soil. The Neva freezes early that year. The cold becomes the enemy's ally. Temperatures plunge to -30 degrees Celsius. Windows shatter from frost. Pipes freeze solid. Electricity fails. The city goes dark. Bodies pile up in courtyards, frozen stiff where they fell. Horses die in the streets and are butchered for food. Funeral carts make endless rounds, collecting the dead. And still, the city works. Factories continue to produce shells. Artists continue to paint. Writers record every day in diaries, the sounds, the smells, the unbearable quiet between shellings. One wrote simply, "I am no longer afraid of bombs. I am afraid of bread." The siege is no longer just a military event. It is a test of the human soul. By November, hunger is no longer a condition, it is an atmosphere. People move slowly, like ghosts in the snow. The once vibrant boulevards are silent except for the creak of sleds carrying corpses. Bread rations shrink again. The average citizen consumes less than 300 calories a day. Mothers save crumbs for their children. Children stop crying because their bodies no longer have strength. In stairwells, families huddle together beneath blankets, burning furniture for warmth. The government broadcasts classical music on the radio, not for entertainment, but to signal that the city is still alive. When the music stops, it means the Germans are bombing again. There are no cats or dogs left. Even crows have vanished. Some families disappear quietly into the dark, unable to bear another day. Others write notes before they die, leaving behind names and addresses, hoping someone will survive to remember them. One diary entry reads, "We are learning what it means to be human without food, without heat, without light. Only love remains." And yet, amid the suffering, miracles occur. In a small apartment near the Fontanka River, a woman named Dmitrieva keeps 17 orphan children alive by melting snow and boiling soup made of wallpaper paste. In another district, a music teacher continues to hold lessons, even as frost forms on the piano keys. The people of Leningrad refuse to vanish. Factories reopen despite bombings. Workers faint at their stations, are revived, and continue. The city's newspaper is still printed, though it grows thinner each week, until only a single sheet remains. On it are the words, "Leningrad lives." But death walks openly through the streets. By January 1942, the official death toll exceeds 200,000. The true number is higher. Morgues are full, cemeteries frozen. Families dig graves with spoons. The enemy still shells the city daily, but hunger kills far more efficiently than any bomb. And yet, no one speaks of surrender. When a German loudspeaker offers amnesty to anyone willing to lay down arms, the reply from the defenders is silence, and then, faintly, the sound of the national anthem carried across the frozen air. The people of Leningrad are starving. But they are not broken. In a frozen city where people were dying for a piece of bread, music somehow refused to die. In the heart of Leningrad, under blackout curtains and bombardment, lived a composer, Dmitri Shostakovich. He could have fled. Many urged him to. But he stayed. He said, "The people are suffering, and I must share their fate." He began work on his 7th symphony, later known as the Leningrad Symphony, a musical defiance written amid hunger and fire. At night, as bombs shook the city, Shostakovich wrote by candlelight. His manuscript pages trembled in the draft from shattered windows. The symphony grew not from instruments, but from endurance, a sound of heartbeat and resistance. When he was finally evacuated east, the unfinished score remained in Leningrad, copied and passed from hand to hand like a secret weapon. Months later, in the summer of 1942, the city's musicians decided it would be performed right here, in the besieged city itself. The Leningrad Radio Orchestra, reduced to 15 starving survivors, was reassembled. Musicians too weak to hold their instruments were carried to the rehearsal hall. Others were drafted from the front, brought from the trenches to play. They practiced in their coats, fingers numb, notes trembling in the cold. Outside, German artillery boomed. Inside, the music of survival began to take shape. The performance was set for August 9, 1942, the very day Hitler had planned a banquet in the captured city. Instead, the Soviets prepared a different feast, a symphony for the living and the dead. The Red Army launched an offensive to silence German guns long enough for the concert to proceed. Loudspeakers were placed throughout Leningrad, and even facing enemy lines. When the conductor raised his baton, the city fell silent. Across the ruins, the first notes of Shostakovich's symphony echoed through the air, soft, mournful, rising from despair to defiance. People wept openly. Soldiers on both sides lowered their rifles. One German prisoner later said, "When we heard that music, we knew we would never take Leningrad." For 75 minutes, the starving city remembered what it meant to be alive. The performance ended to thunderous applause, not from hands, but from hearts still beating. In that moment, amid ruin and hunger, art became resistance. And the symphony of survival played louder than any cannon. The winter of 1941–42 was the coldest in a century. By December, the temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. The snow no longer melted, it simply grew higher, burying cars, bodies, and hope beneath it. Hunger had become routine. People stopped speaking of meals. Instead, they measured time between slices of bread. Bread rations fell again, 125 grams per day for civilians. A small crust, dark, heavy, laced with sawdust. It was the currency of life. The weak could not bury their dead. Corpses lay in stairwells and courtyards until they froze solid. The frozen were used as furniture, as walls to block the wind. Whole apartments became tombs. Electricity had failed completely. Gas lines froze. Water was drawn from holes cut in the ice of the Neva. Each bucket cost lives, people collapsing from exhaustion on the way home. In diaries, survivors wrote of seeing death not as horror but as release. When I wake, I listen for my heart. If it still beats, I rise. At night, the shells fell. During the day, snowflakes mixed with ashes from the burning suburbs. Hunger made people hallucinate, visions of warm bread, of summer trees, of laughter. And yet, something astonishing persisted. Children still went to makeshift schools, where lessons were taught in whispers by candlelight. Libraries opened for warmth. People read Tolstoy and Pushkin aloud to distract from pain. Workers repaired tanks using frozen oil, engineers kept power plants running by sheer will. Even in starvation, there was structure, an invisible rhythm that kept the city alive. One morning, a tram, the only one still working, moved down the central avenue. It carried no passengers, only a sign that read, "This tram is running to remind you that Leningrad still lives." As the months passed, the population shrank by hundreds of thousands. The cemeteries froze solid, forcing families to stack the dead like firewood until spring thaw. When spring came, it revealed not salvation but horror. The snow melted, uncovering a landscape of bones. The smell filled the air for weeks. Yet the city refused to fall. The Red Army held its lines. The factories continued to forge shells. Children still sang. It was survival reduced to its rawest form, not victory, not hope, but sheer endurance. They had no food, no fuel, no light. But they still had Leningrad. Of all who suffered during the siege, the children carried its quietest pain. In 1941, more than 400,000 children lived in the city. By 1942, most had died or been evacuated across the ice. Those who remained became witnesses to both horror and heroism. In diaries later found hidden in school desks and attics, their handwriting trembles across the page, small, uneven, human. They wrote of hunger, of cold, of the strange silence after bombings. They wrote not as victims, but as observers of a world that had forgotten what warmth was. One child wrote, "Mama says we must be brave. I don't feel brave. I just want to sleep and not wake up hungry." Another? "There are no cats anymore. We draw them instead." The schools that remained open were unheated, their windows broken and covered in frost. Children wore multiple coats, hats indoors, and mittens while writing. Their teachers, half-starved, taught lessons on endurance, on literature, on music, anything to remind them that they were still human. At night, children learned to recognize the sound of different bombs. The shriek of a dive bomber, the whistle of artillery, each had its rhythm. They learned when to run and when to lie still. Some were sent across Lake Ladoga, the only lifeline to the outside world, frozen solid in winter. Trucks carried them over ice so thin it groaned beneath the wheels. Many never reached the other side. Those who did were scattered across the Soviet Union, growing up far from home, haunted by memories of snow and silence. Yet even within the city, small acts of joy survived. a teacher recalled organizing a children's choir, their voices weak but pure. They sang songs of victory, of spring. They sang, she said, so that the city would not forget what innocence sounded like. When the siege finally ended, many of those children returned to find their homes gone, their parents buried in mass graves. But they carried the memory of endurance, a proof that even the smallest hearts can survive the largest horrors. In the years after the war, Leningrad's children would grow into its storytellers, its musicians, its architects. They would rebuild the city from ashes, stone by stone. And they would teach the world that to survive is not merely to live, but is to remember. Winter carved a white tomb around Leningrad, but it also gave birth to a miracle. When Lake Ladoga froze, it became a bridge, a fragile, groaning artery of survival. They called it the Road of Life. Across that ice ran the only link between the dying city and the rest of the Soviet Union. Trucks, sledges, and horses carried flour, medicine, and ammunition into Leningrad, and carried people, mostly children, out. The journey was perilous. The ice was thin, the temperature brutal, the sky alive with German bombers. Drivers traveled at night, headlights off, guided by the faint glimmer of stars and the ghostly reflection of the moon. If a truck strayed from the convoy, it vanished into the black water. Sometimes the ice cracked beneath an entire line of vehicles, swallowing men, food, and hope in seconds. The sound of the ice groaning beneath the weight of survival haunted everyone who drove that road. They said it sounded like the earth itself was crying. Yet every day, they returned. Women, teenagers, even the elderly volunteered. Each trip could be their last. Each kilometer gained meant a city breathing for one more day. Convoys carried sacks of flour and barrels of fuel. On the return, they carried evacuees, pale, silent figures wrapped in blankets. Some were still alive when they reached the far shore. Some were not. By the end of the winter of 1942, more than 500,000 people had escaped through the Road of Life. But for every life saved, another was lost within the city's frozen heart. Still, the road endured, a shining thread of defiance against an empire determined to starve an entire people. Every survivor remembered that sound, the crunch of ice, the hum of engines, the whistle of bombs. And beyond it all, the heartbeat of a city refusing to die. In the museums of modern St. Petersburg, a single artifact remains, a piece of the frozen road, preserved in glass. It is cracked, grey, lifeless. But to those who know, it speaks louder than words. It says, "We lived." If hunger was a slow death, the bombings were sudden. The sky above Leningrad never slept. From dawn to dusk, and through the endless nights, the city was shelled by artillery and bombed by aircraft. Some days, the raids lasted 12 hours straight. The Germans targeted everything: power stations, hospitals, orphanages, bakeries. Their goal was not victory, but annihilation. Hitler had ordered, erase Leningrad from the map. The people called it the Storm of Steel. The air would grow still for a moment, then the sirens would rise, that long, haunting wail that froze blood before a single bomb fell. Then came the thunder, the shaking walls, the falling ceilings. Entire apartment blocks vanished in seconds. The Kirov factory, one of the last working plants, was hit 27 times, yet it continued producing shells. Workers emerged from rubble, brushed off the dust, and went back to their machines. Every family had its ritual. When the siren sounded, they gathered in the hallway, the safest place from flying glass. Mothers shielded children with their bodies. Neighbors held hands. When the all-clear came, they would rise to count who was missing. One survivor remembered. "We were not afraid of dying. We were afraid of being buried alive." The dead were carried out at dawn. Burial teams worked between raids, pushing sleds loaded with bodies to the cemeteries. In winter, the ground was too hard to dig, so they built wooden walls of ice to mark mass graves. And yet, amid the destruction, there was order. Fire brigades still operated, librarians saved books from burning buildings, nurses ran into collapsing hospitals to drag the wounded to safety. The people learned to read the bombs, their pitch, their distance. When an explosion was far away, they prayed for others. When it was near, they whispered their final words. The sound became part of life, like the ticking of a clock. It measured not time, but endurance. In diaries, survivors wrote of strange beauty amid horror, sunsets turning the smoke into gold, snowflakes glittering in the light of burning buildings. The city, even in agony, refused to lose its soul. When the symphony orchestra played again that winter, the sound of distant shelling was not edited out from the radio broadcast. It was left in, as part of the music of survival. For the people of Leningrad, silence was never peace. Silence meant only that another wave was coming. In a world collapsing into darkness, kindness became the rarest and most powerful act of resistance. There were no heroes left in shining armor, only ordinary people doing extraordinary things. In one apartment, a woman tore her ration card in half so her neighbor's child could eat. In another, a nurse who had lost her entire family still walked through blizzards to reach her patients. In the bread lines, strangers shared their last crumbs. They did not speak. They simply held out their hands. A librarian named Olga Bergholz, half-starved, continued broadcasting on the city's radio, her voice frail, trembling, but alive. Every night, she read poems, messages, and names of the living and the dead. She became the voice of the siege. Her words gave the city something more important than food, hope. She said, "No one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten." There were doctors who performed surgeries without anesthesia, teachers who wrote lessons on scraps of paper with burnt sticks, soldiers who gave their bread to the old. Even German prisoners of war were sometimes given soup by citizens who had nothing, a quiet act of humanity amid unimaginable cruelty. There are stories of soldiers who carried children through snow until they froze standing, still holding the living in their arms. Of musicians who continued to play on ruined streets. Of families who lit a single candle every night, not for warmth, but for remembrance. In the siege, death was everywhere, but so was compassion. It was the invisible force that held the city together. Historians later calculated that over 1 million civilians perished. But they could never count how many lives were saved by gestures of kindness. When the siege finally ended, survivors would say that humanity had not only endured, it had triumphed. The bombs had broken stone, hunger had broken bodies, but neither could break the spirit of love that flickered between one dying hand and another. In the Museum of the Siege of Leningrad, there is a single piece of bread, black, small, hardened by time. It weighs 125 grams, the ration of survival. Beside it lies a note. This bread was shared between 4 people. The bread has outlived the empire that tried to destroy them. It remains as proof that kindness, even when starved, does not die. January 1943. The ice on Lake Ladoga cracked beneath the weight of trucks. The city was in its second winter of hunger. Fewer than half of its pre-war inhabitants still lived, most too weak to walk. The bread ration, raised slightly after harvest, could not raise the dead. And yet, on the horizon, something was changing. The Red Army was moving. From the south and east came artillery so heavy that its echoes rolled through the streets of Leningrad like distant thunder. Soldiers at the front whispered that the blockade might soon be broken. No one dared believe it. Hope was a dangerous indulgence. On January 12, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra, Spark. For weeks, they had prepared in silence, moving guns across the frozen swamps, building wooden causeways under cover of night. At dawn, the sky turned crimson as thousands of shells fell upon the German positions. The frozen air burned. 2 armies, advancing from opposite directions, cut through trenches, forests, and ice. For days the battle raged in blizzards so fierce that soldiers fought blind, guided only by the screams of the wounded and the distant rumble of tanks. And then, on January 18, 1943, a signal crackled across the radios of the Soviet front: the blockade of Leningrad has been broken. The corridor opened, a narrow strip of land along Lake Ladoga, only 10 kilometers wide. But through that opening, trucks roared, carrying bread, ammunition, and medicine. People gathered in the streets, staring upward as the first supply planes crossed the sky. Some wept. Others simply stood in silence, too numb to understand that survival might now be possible. The siege, however, was not over. The city remained under fire for another year. German artillery on the southern banks continued to shell Leningrad daily, killing thousands even after the blockade had been pierced. But the end had begun. The rhythm of death slowed. Factories increased production. Children returned to makeshift schools. For the first time in 18 months, the smell of baking bread drifted through certain districts. And then came the final push. In January 1944, after weeks of fierce fighting, Soviet armies launched a massive offensive, Operation January Thunder. The Germans fell back, their lines collapsing under the weight of 1 million men. On January 27, 1944, the guns fell silent. The siege, 872 days long, was over. That night, every surviving cannon in Leningrad fired a victory salute. Artillery thundered 324 times, one for each day of the final battle. People flooded the streets despite the cold, hugging strangers, lighting candles, laying flowers on the graves of those who would never see this dawn. The blockade had ended. But the scars of hunger, loss, and silence would remain for generations. When the shooting stopped, there was no cheer. Only quiet. The people of Leningrad emerged from cellars and ruined buildings into a world that hardly resembled a city. Streets were choked with rubble. Bridges lay twisted. The smell of death lingered everywhere. The official death toll exceeded 1 million civilians, though no one truly knew. Many had died without record, buried under ice or rubble, their names lost in notebooks that froze solid in drawers. Entire families had vanished. Blocks of apartments stood empty, their windows dark, their staircases leading nowhere. Cemeteries overflowed into parks. In Piskariyevsky Cemetery alone, 500,000 lay in mass graves beneath snow and silence. The survivors were not whole. Many had forgotten how to speak in full sentences, their minds slowed by starvation. Others carried invisible scars, eyes that stared too long at bread, hands that trembled when holding food. Some could not bear warmth, fearing it would not last. Yet life began again. People cleaned the streets. Trams rolled once more. Workers returned to factories, rebuilding machines from the wreckage of war. Children drew pictures of spring, flowers blooming where shells had fallen. In 1945, when victory over Germany was announced, Leningrad did not celebrate wildly. Its people stood in Red Square, heads bowed, remembering those who were not there. Even decades later, survivors refused to waste a crumb of bread. They stored food, rationed habitually, and told their grandchildren, "We once ate glue. Remember this when you waste." The price of survival was written not just in numbers, but in habits, in memories, in the quiet resilience that shaped a city's soul. Historians called Leningrad a miracle of endurance. The survivors simply called it duty. They had not chosen heroism. They had chosen not to die. Today, Leningrad is St. Petersburg again, its palaces restored, its canals alive with reflection and light. But beneath its beauty lies another city, one built from memory. Walk through its streets in winter, and you can still feel it, the silence of hunger, the echo of distant sirens, the weight of unspoken grief. At Piskariyevsky Cemetery, marble paths lead to endless fields of grass, each square marking thousands who never received a name. At the far end stands a granite statue of a woman, the motherland. Her hands are empty, her face calm. She does not weep. She watches. On the pedestal are carved the words of Olga Bergholz. No one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten. Every year, on January 27th, the people of St. Petersburg gather there with candles. Old men in medals stand beside children in bright coats. They lay flowers on the snow and listen to the silence, a silence that belongs only to those who remember. For what was Leningrad if not proof of the human spirit's refusal to yield? The siege was not just a battle between armies, it was a struggle between despair and dignity, between destruction and endurance. And though the city starved, burned, and bled, it never surrendered. When asked how they endured, survivors often answered not with speeches, but with gestures, a shrug, a tear, a faint smile. For those who lived through it, words were too small. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. It was not a victory of weapons, but of will. Not a triumph of ideology, but of humanity itself. And as the sun sets over the Neva, gilding the domes of St. Isaac's and the spire of the Admiralty, one truth remains. Empires fall. Wars fade. But the city that refused to die still stands. Leningrad lives.